In Romans chapter 9, Paul uses these phrases, vessels unto honor and vessels unto dishonor. Is Paul talking about those that have been chosen before the foundations of the world to be damned and those that have been chosen to be saved? Or is there another meaning that's found in the text if we're just willing to dig deeper? That's what we're going to look at in this video. Hi, I'm Pastor DJ Harry, and this is part 4, I believe, of a series that I've been doing on Romans chapter 9. You know, I had something interesting happen this last week. I was talking to someone who had been visiting our church, and he said, you know, Pastor Harry, it's rare that I see pastors that believe what we believe, that are willing to take on Romans chapter 9. And honestly, I think that's a shame. I think it's sad that as pastors, we're not willing to go into the text and really understand what it says. Obviously, there are those that would take Romans chapter 9 and would really hold it up as a proof text for Calvinism, as really the preeminent text to teach unconditional election. But what I would encourage you to do, if you're not familiar with the previous verses in Romans chapter 9, the first maybe 15, 16 verses, if you'll go back, and I'm going to put up in the right above, I'm going to put a link to the previous videos that I've made where we've talked about and really talked through those verses to understand what they mean. But today we come to Romans chapter 9, verse 19 through 24 is really the passage we're going to look at today. And in that passage, Paul is going to discuss those particular words that we looked at in our introduction. It's the phrase vessels unto honor and vessels unto dishonor, which often people use them in reference to those that have been chosen sovereignly by God for salvation and those who have been chosen sovereignly by God for damnation. And so I want us to dig into that passage today and really let the text speak to us instead of us forcing onto the text what we think it says, which I think often is a danger when we come to a passage like Romans 9. We already have in our minds what the text is going to say, and we sort of force that into the text of the passage. I want us to just dig out of the passage. Let the text tell us what it means. Now, we cannot go into verses 19 through 24 without just a 1-minute summary. So bear with me for the previous 18 verses, just 1 minute. Verses 1 through 13, Paul is burdened for the nation of Israel because they have missed out on God's blessing. So Paul gives us a short history lesson, and he talks about basically the pathway through Israel, those earliest fathers of the nation of Israel and God's promises and covenants to them. We come to verse 15, for he saith to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. And if you think that that's talking about redemptive mercy, then go back to the video specifically titled God having mercy on whom he will have mercy. And in that video, we talk specifically about the context of that passage back in the book of Numbers. Is that talking about redemptive mercy? And then we come to verse 16, so it is not of him that willeth, nor of him that runneth, but God that showeth mercy. And again, God is the one that shows mercy, but is he talking about redemptive mercy? And he's not. He's talking about the calling of those who will be the seed or the nation of Israel to bring about the Messiah. Verse 17, we see the example of Pharaoh. If God can use rebellious Israel, God can also use Pharaoh and his hardness and the blindness of Pharaoh in order to accomplish what he wants. So then verse 18, therefore he will have mercy on whom he will have mercy, and whom he will he hardeneth. So if you look at this really kind of from a Calvinistic view, and for those of you who are watching who would go that direction, soteriology, what we're doing today is not an attack. I'm not covering this because I am trying to make enemies. I just believe it's our job as pastors to dig into God's word and to be able to explain it in a way that's understandable and is true to what the text says. And so as best as I can, this is a accurate representation of what the text says without trying to force any meaning into the text. And so we come into verse number 19, and we come to another argument that arises in the text. And this is not the first argument. This is something that we've covered all the way back since the first video, which is Romans 9 explained from a non-Calvinist perspective. That's the first video in the series. And we lay out who Paul is talking to. Because understanding Paul's, the objector in this conversation, is helpful to understanding why these questions keep coming up. And so in verse 19, there's an obvious objection that Paul is going to address through an answer. And he's just going to give an answer in verse number 19 and address the objection. So the objection would be this: how can God hold unbelieving Jews accountable for their rejection if God actively used their hardened state for his purpose? And it flows right from the previous verses. If God used Israel in its hardness and God used Pharaoh in his hardness, then how can God then hold them accountable? And we know that's the objection because Paul is going to address that objection in verse 19. Paul says this: "Thou wilt say then unto me," meaning I understand this is what you're thinking, so this is what you would say, "Why doth he yet find fault?" Or how can God find fault for who hath resisted his will? How can God find fault with Israel or even with Pharaoh, who was in his hardness? How can God find fault with them? If it was God's intention that he would use them in their hardness, then are they really responsible for their hardness? Now, we would have to say for a second, to those who believe in Calvinism and really believe that all things come about because they are foreordained by God, the answer to this honestly would have to be no, meaning how can someone be at fault for something for which they had no control over? And this is just a reality of life. I refuse to be accountable for something that I cannot control. That was a motto that I had years ago when I was a youth pastor. And we would have a teenager that refused to submit to the authority to submit to my authority. And so it was time to go on a missions trip, and they wanted to go on a missions trip, and I said, "I'm sorry, you can't go." And they said, "But I want to go," or "I want to go on this trip to go whitewater rafting." And I would say, "Listen, I cannot be accountable for something or someone that I cannot control. Because when you act in a way that is out of my control, I still stand accountable for it, and I refuse to do that." Well, how can God hold Israel accountable for their hardness if somehow God hardened them? That's the question. And so verse 20, he goes on and says, "But nay, O man, who art thou that repliest against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, Why hast thou made me thus? Hath not the potter power over the clay of the same lump to make one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor?" Now we focus in on verse 20 for just a second, where Paul says, "Why hast thou made me thus?" And this is a very important thing for us to think about. At the beginning of verse number 20, Paul says, "Nay, but O man." So the O man is the objector. And it's critical that we understand who the objector is, because the objector becomes the focus of the next three verses. And please understand, verse number 20 is often thrown in the face of those that would believe a different soteriology than Calvinism. And it will be thrown at us as saying, "Who are you to question God? Who are you to question God's plan of salvation or God's plan of sovereign control?" Unfortunately, that's not what the verse is saying. And it has to be taken out of its context to say that, because I'm not the "oh man" that Paul is talking to. The imaginary person, again, is critical, because who Paul is talking to becomes the focus of the next three verses. Now, there are two possible interpretations. Okay, possible interpretation number one is that the "oh man" that Paul's talking to is the same person he's been talking to this entire time. And that is a religious Jew, a follower of the law, confused about God's working in Israel and them being God's chosen people. And yet, how can I be God's chosen people and yet I'm not part of really the body of Christ, or I'm not part of true Israel because I'm not a believer? And that seems to be consistent throughout the entire passage, that's who Paul is talking to. So that's option one. That's the option I hold to. I believe hermeneutically, that's the only option we can follow. The second option, though, is that we make a change. And the second option is that the O man is now a new person. And the new person is now you or me, or someone who is now questioning God's role in salvation. Even though Paul hasn't been talking about salvation specifically, he's talking about Israel being the elect of God to bring about the pathway to redemption. We would have to make a jump and say, okay, now this O man is talking about us. It's talking about a person who would resist salvation, a person today who's dealing with us as Gentiles. The questioner is you and me. And so we have to, in my opinion, we have to look at this verse, the preceding verses and the next verses, based on the O man being the exact same man that we've been following through this entire passage. I believe it is inconsistent to begin changing who the focus is unless the text specifically says it. And so in this case, the O man, I believe, must be the same religious, hardened, unbelieving Jew that Paul has been talking to this whole time. Now, if that's the case, and I believe it flows perfectly then into the next few verses, if that's the case, that's why Paul then uses Old Testament examples of Israel as dealing with the potter and the clay. And I think often we would take that O man verse, who are you? Let me go back. Who are you? Shall the same thing formed say to him that formed it, why hast thou made me thus? And if we make that about salvation, then dealing with those that would reject salvation or would question God's sovereignty over the sovereign determination of who is the elect, then the next few verses then jump right back out of context, because these next few verses have nothing to do with salvation. They have everything to do with Israel being God's elect people. And so verse 21, hath not the potter power over clay of the same lump to make one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor? He's going to use two different references in this passage, and there are two Old Testament references that deal with the potter and the clay. And I want to put those up on the screen for you. In fact, I just did, I believe. I want us to look at those verses because I want us to see the parallel that Paul is drawing and why he's using a passage from Isaiah and a passage from Jeremiah to make his point. So in Isaiah chapter 59, that's where we're going to go first. Broad look. So Isaiah chapter 45 is where we're going to go first. And we're going to take a broad look at Isaiah 45 into Isaiah 44 into Isaiah 45 and get the context, okay? Isaiah 44, verse 1. Remember, Jacob, you were chosen by me. That's not a salvific choosing. That's God choosing Jacob over Esau. Interesting how that comes up in the previous verses that we just looked at in Romans. Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated. God says, I've chosen you. 44 verse 6, I am the true God. 44 verses 9 through 15 talks about the vanity of gods made by hand. Chapter 44 verse 21, remember, you are mine, I formed you. Chapter 44 verse 24, I am the Lord that maketh all things. And then chapter 44 verse 28, even Cyrus the Great, you are my creation, and I will use you to accomplish my will. God looks at even the unbelieving King Cyrus and says, even you are mine to accomplish my will. Not salvific choosing, clearly a choosing to accomplish his purposes for Israel to bring about the Messiah. Verse 28, that saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and I will perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid. So Paul is referencing back to these Isaiah passages that are dealing with Israel and God using Israel, Jacob, and even unbelieving Cyrus to accomplish his will. So then we come to chapter 45, which is actually the passage that Paul is then referencing to. In verses 1 through 4, of 45, God proclaims that he's going to use Cyrus to accomplish his will with Israel. In verse 5, he says, even though you don't know me, Cyrus, I was guiding you to accomplish my plan. Why? Because I'm the God of heavens. I created all things. And then we come to Isaiah 45, verse 9. Notice what it says. Woe unto him that striveth with his maker. Let the potsherd strive with the potsherds of the earth. Shall the clay say to him that fashioned it, what makest thou, or thy work, he hath no hands? I mean, Paul is drawing a direct comparison to an Isaiah passage which any religious unbelieving Jew or believing Jew, any religious Jew would know these passages. I think we take for granted when we see New Testament references to the Old Testament that they're vague references. No. They would have known these passages. Isaiah was very well known, often memorized by devout Jewish followers. And so when Paul begins quoting Isaiah 45, their minds immediately would have gone to that passage. And Paul quotes pretty much verbatim verse number 9, which says, shall the clay say to him that fashioned it, what makest thou, or thy work, he hath no hands? The context of that passage in Isaiah 45 is not salvific. The context in that passage is clearly God using his will to accomplish what he wants with Israel, whether it's through Jacob, the elect, or whether it's through Cyrus, who was an unbeliever. All right? Jeremiah chapter 18, another passage that sort of connects in. And Jeremiah chapter 18, verses 1, God's dealing with a prophecy to Israel through Jeremiah. Verse number 3, Jeremiah's watching a literal potter working his clay on the wheel. Now, I don't know if you know this about me, but I've mentioned before that I'm a pastor here in Central North Carolina. And by Central North Carolina, I mean I'm about 7 miles north of the town called Starr. And it's called Starr because if you take the geographical center of North Carolina, that is the star in the middle of the map. That's the center of the state. About 7 miles north of Starr, North Carolina, is a town called Seagrove, which is the pottery capital of the United States. We have over 45 active potters here in our community. We have about 3 or 4 potters that are in our church alone, and it is incredible the pottery that they can produce. I love all of the pottery. It's wonderful. So often when I go and visit people in our church, if they are those that are potters, if they're actually working on the wheel, I will go back and I'll stand beside them and I'll watch them working on the wheel because it's amazing to watch them work with their hands. Well, that's exactly what Jeremiah is doing. He's watching a literal potter working on his clay on the wheel. Verse number 4, the vessel is marred. So it didn't turn out how he thought it would. So what every potter does is they take that clay and they take it off and they pound that clay down to a lump. They work the air bubbles and then they make that clay into another vessel. And then in verse 5 and 6, Jeremiah says, Israel, this is you. This is a national message to Israel. This is a national message really with national consequences. Israel, you are this clay. You are the vessels that because of your rejection and because of your unwillingness to be used in your idolatry, God is continually having to remake you. In fact, verse 10 says, if it do evil in my sight that I obey not my voice, then I will repent of the good wherewith I said I would benefit them. The prophecy to them is, if you will do good, if you will obey, if you will worship me, then you will become a vessel unto honor. But if not, I have the right to destroy you and break you back down and to rebuild you into a vessel that is pleasing to me. Now, these verses, Jeremiah 18 and Isaiah 45, in context of what Paul is saying in Romans chapter 9, have no connection to redemptive mercy. Paul is not using these trying to make a completely different point other than the point that they were being used to make. In fact, in context, he's making the exact same point. God has the power to use whoever he wills to accomplish his will, And he's dealing specifically here with Israel, God's chosen people who had walked away, who had chosen not to worship him, who had chosen to follow after idols. So there's an inaccurate, I believe, but a popular interpretation about this passage. And I want to share it here because this is often the interpretation you'll hear. Who are you, O man, that is either saved or unsaved, to question God's irresistible work of mercy in some and not others? And it's often used as a rebuke to people who would hold my position, that who are you to question that God has the right to damn those to hell even though they do not have a chance to come to salvation? Who are you to question that? But that's not at all what Paul is saying. You literally have to take that verse out of the context of Isaiah 45 and Jeremiah 18. And I would challenge you, if you hear someone taking this passage and they're interpreting it based on and they're making an application toward a Calvinistic soteriology, if you're just willing to take the references that Paul uses, he has referenced Hosea, he has referenced Isaiah, he has referenced Jeremiah. Go back in the book of Numbers, in the previous videos that we've done in this series, over and over, we go back to the Old Testament passage because I'm not going to interpret Paul's words based on what I want them to say. I'm going to interpret Paul's words based on what he means them to say in the context of the verses that he's quoting. And that's important. And that's a challenge to you. If you take these difficult passages and instead of just forcing a context into them, actually allow the context to tell you what it's saying, then often you'll come up with maybe a different interpretation than what many people will say it means. Now, we come then to verse number 22. What if God, willing to show his wrath and make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted for destruction? So now Paul is going to sort of switch gears and he's going to reveal why God has done all of this. The long suffering, the remolding, the mercy. Hey, let's be honest. God was very merciful to Israel. God was long-suffering to Israel. Why did God do that? Why did God over and over display incredible mercy to people that lived in hardness and rebellion? And there's one answer, and the answer is redemption. And it wasn't for their redemption. It was to bring about redemption for all mankind. I'm preaching through the book of Mark right now, and we are about, I think, 35 sermons in. I'm in Mark chapter 14, an incredible passage where we're looking at we looked at the Lord's Supper last week, the Last Supper there in Mark chapter 14. And in that passage, everything that Jesus did about that meal was intentional. It was not by accident. Where they went for the Last Supper was intentional. Where they sat was intentional. Jesus washing their feet was intentional. The fact that they took the elements in the order that they did was intentional. But then the fact that Jesus exposes who Judas is, exposes that he would be betrayed, though the disciples didn't understand it, Jesus did not shy away from the cross. He did not walk away from the cross. He did not walk away from that difficult path. It was a path to redemption. And that path to redemption didn't start in Mark chapter 14. That path to redemption started all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. It started all the way back when you see that first mention of a Redeemer. It goes back to Genesis with God's promise to Abraham that through him all nations would be blessed. And then we see that working through Abraham all the way, that pathway to redemption. Why was God long-suffering to Israel? And there's one answer, and the answer is redemption. The redemption of all mankind. Why? What if God, verse 22, willing to show his wrath and make his power known, he endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction? God endured those of Israel who were constantly living in a state of rebellion and hardness. Why? Verse 23, that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he hath afore prepared unto glory, And now Paul is going to conclude this part with a wonderful truth. He's going to bring all Gentiles into the picture. What if God, let this sink in, what if God, willing to show his power and wrath, that's Israel and Pharaoh, he endured with much long suffering, he endured all of those who were living in rebellion, that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy. Notice what he says in verse 4, even us, who he hath called not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. Oh man, wow, this is incredible. Paul is saying God was long-suffering to harden Israel. He formed them as a vessel of wrath. He allowed them to dwell in their wrath. He was long-suffering to them in their hardness for one reason, so that redemption could take place and salvation could then be made available to all men, not to the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. God made this promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 that through him all families of the world of the earth would be blessed. And it's not of the Jews only, but it's all that call on his name. Do you realize that that's been true always in the scriptures, whether it's the Old Testament or New Testament? You know, often when we think about the verses that deal with whosoever and all who will call upon his name, we go to passages in the New Testament. Listen to Joel chapter 2, verse 32. It says this, and it shall come to pass that whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be delivered. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem shall be deliverance, as the Lord hath said, and in the remnant who the Lord shall call. The whosoever has been all the way back from the Old Testament, goes all the way through the New Testament. And Paul is going to conclude this in Romans 10 when he says this, there is no difference between the Jew or the Greek, for the same Lord over all is rich unto all that call upon him. For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Now this passage reveals three very important truths as we finish today. Three simple applications. Number one, God is going to accomplish his will. God is going to accomplish his will. Look at all of the times that Israel dwelt in rebellion and hardness. And over and over and over, God said, I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. I will be long-suffering to whom I will be long-suffering. Why? Because I'm going to accomplish my will of redemption. God is going to accomplish his will. How much better is it for us to be willing to be part of God's plan rather than to dwell in hardness? Number two, God is wonderfully working out his plan in your life even when you don't see it. You know, when we look at the Old Testament, often we don't see how God is bringing about the plan of redemption. We see hardened, rebellious Israel, and we say, God, why don't you just destroy them? But God says, no, I'm working out my plan. You know, sometimes in our life, there are things that we go through, difficulties and trials, and it's hard to trust that God is working out his plan in our life. And my encouragement to you is trust in God. He's a good God. Number three is this. The Old Testament account of Israel should always be read forward-looking. You know, I think we fall into the trap of reading the book of Numbers, thinking that the book of Numbers is only about Israel at that point. Thinking that the book of Exodus is only about Israel as they are leaving Egypt. Thinking that the book of Leviticus is only about Israel and the Levitical law. Thinking that that the book of Joshua is only about Israel and Joshua and them conquering the land, and we forget that all of that history of Israel should be read forward-looking. It was all in God's plan to bring about the Messiah so that salvation could be offered to every man. I'm so glad that you watched this video. Hey, I want to encourage you, click the subscribe button and hit the bell notification. And we've got one more video in this series as we wrap up Romans chapter 9, and you won't want to miss that as we move forward. God bless.